Let me turn finally to the roles of fission and fusion. Some of this will be review, I know, to many people in the room, but I will say a little bit at the end about what I personally think about where we're headed here. The current contribution, about 440 reactors in the world. The percentage of the world's electricity has actually been falling. In 2009, it was down to 13%. A few years ago, it was 16 or 17%. So we're not going in the right direction in terms of an increasing share of nuclear, although the number of reactors is slowly increasing. If we complete the ones that are currently under construction around the world, the total will be about 500 reactors and a little over 430 electrical gigawatts. In the United States, we still have 104 operating power reactors. They're generating about 20% of U.S. electricity. In the United States, as of the 1st of October, we had one more under construction, 9 additional planned for another 13 electrical gigawatts. Worldwide, most of those reactors are light water reactors, the rest mainly heavy water reactors, gas-cooled reactors, and graphite moderated reactors. If we ask what is going to govern the expandability of nuclear energy, both in the United States and worldwide, there are several obvious factors. One is what happens to the demand for electricity. How much economic growth is there going to be? How rapidly will the electrification of economies around the world proceed? Particularly there, how rapidly will we electrify transportation? How rapidly will we introduce electric vehicles? Also depends on the success of improvements in end-use efficiency. And a second point in demand is the ability of nuclear energy to deliver non-electricity energy products. Its potential for expansion is greater if it can deliver high-temperature process heat and hydrogen, for example, as well as electricity. In terms of economics, many factors are germane. The cost of electricity, the cost just of construction, the risk premium, how much more it costs you to finance a nuclear plant because those investments are still considered risky. The unit size, how big does a nuclear reactor have to be, because that affects the lumpiness of the investment. Does an electric utility have to bet the company to build one, or can you make them smaller? And of course, the economics of competing sources. What is solar going to cost? What is clean coal, or cleaner coal, one would more accurately say, going to cost? Resource availability, how much uranium is out there? What is the supply of uranium versus the cost? And what will the supply of uranium and its cost do in terms of our choices of fuel cycles and the kinds of reactors we use? Safety and environment. What's germane there, and this comes back to David Rose's question, compared to what, in which he was one of the masters of forcing people to confront that question. The comparison in terms of safety and environment with the alternatives, both in fact and in perception. That means radioactive wastes and reactor safety on the nuclear side versus air pollution, climate change, and land use, which are the principal liabilities of much of the competition. In international security, there are issues of dependence and independence, where generally nuclear energy is seen as an asset, because even if everybody doesn't have uranium, it's quite easy to store. And on the other side, the question of nuclear weapon proliferation, which Mrs. Rose mentioned in her opening remarks. If you look at the economics question, this is from the MIT Future of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle study of 2010. Basically what it shows is, in economic terms, the fossil fuels, the main fossil fuels used for electricity generation, coal and natural gas, are still cheaper than nuclear energy, although there are two things that could change that. One would be a significant carbon charge, and the other would be if the risk premium for building nuclear reactors were to be taken away and the cost of financing equalized. And those are the bases of two thrusts in administration energy policy. One thrust is financial incentives which have the effect, loan guarantees, that have the effect of neutralizing the risk premium, and an effort to get a price on carbon, which would be what we need. I suggest that carbon charges in the range of the $25 per ton of CO2 that is indicated here is what it would take to make nuclear competitive with coal, although still not with natural gas, except at high natural gas prices, are highly likely by 2025. All the recalcitrants of the current Congress notwithstanding, I personally believe we're going to have carbon prices that high or higher in the next 15 years. Another interesting point is that small modular reactors might be able to drop certainly could drop the unit cost, that is how much it costs to build one reactor because they're much smaller, but might even be able to drop the cost of electricity. In terms of uranium reserves and resources, here I'm in complete agreement with the MIT nuclear studies. There are various estimates of how much uranium is out there, but if you look at how much ordinary once-through light water reactors could afford to pay for uranium and still be more economical than more advanced reactors and fuel cycles, the answer is there's probably something like 100 million tons of uranium out there. That was the conclusion of the 2010 MIT study. That was my own conclusion from a study of this that we conducted at the little church school up the street a few years ago. And if you look at the implications of that amount of uranium, 100 million tons of uranium would provide over 100 years of uranium to a world that had 3,500 large nuclear reactors, 3,500 gigawatts in it. That's a huge amount. We're not going to get there anytime, probably in this century. So running out of uranium is certainly not the issue. What the 2003 MIT study did then is looked at a number of alternatives for how much nuclear power there might be, depending on the rate of growth of electricity as a whole and the rate of increase of the nuclear market share. At the time they did this study, the market share was about 17%. So they started with that. As I mentioned, it's unfortunately gone down. But they looked for different rates of growth of electricity out to 2050. They looked at what if market share for nuclear energy stays at 17%? What if it goes to 20? What if it goes to 25? And the number of electrical gigawatts, or nominal large 1 gigawatt nuclear power reactors in 2050, then ranges from 650, compared to about 440 today, to 1,500 and some, almost 4 times what we have today. And to understand what that means, one can do some interesting calculations. What I looked at here is consider a 1,700 number, a little higher than the high MIT range for 2050, which is halfway to a world of 3,500 gigawatts in 2100, or about 10 times more in 2100 than we had in 2000. And to get a sense of the size of that operation, if you look at the enrichment that they would require, and then ask what does that mean for proliferation, if 0.1% of that enrichment work were devoted, or diverted, you might say, to the production of highly enriched uranium, that would make enough for 20 to 80 bombs. So that means you can't afford to have 0.1% of the enrichment diverted. If half of those reactors were recycling the plutonium, the associated flow of separated directly weapon-usable plutonium would be 170,000 kilograms a year, which means that diversion of 0.1% of that would be enough to make 30 implosion-type plutonium bombs. That's unacceptable. We can't have diversion of even 0.1% if we were in a large plutonium recycle economy. In terms of spent fuel production, those reactors on the current fuel cycle would make about 34,000 tons of spent fuel per year, which would be a nominal Yucca Mountain every 2 years if Yucca Mountain were going to exist and if it stuck to its nominal capacity of 70,000 metric tons of fuel. That just gives you a sense of scale. Look at safety and environment. Reactor safety in a world of 1,700 or more reactors would probably be considered adequate if we could keep the probability of a major core melt accident to the range of 10 to the minus 6, that is 1 in a million per reactor per year. That's probably already achieved by the best current designs, at least in the absence of somebody deliberately attacking or trying to sabotage the reactor. We might need some additional effort against that last possibility. Radioactive wastes, I would suggest, have to be shown to be manageable without significant worker or public radiation exposure in the short to medium term. with the expectation of a problem-free permanent solution in the long term. I think this is clearly achievable technically, relying, again, as the MIT study recommended, on centralized engineered interim storage in the short to medium term. But getting it right technically doesn't necessarily mean we will win public approval, and that remains a challenge. In terms of proliferation, I believe we need to increase what we call proliferation resistance by a combination of technical and institutional means. In the short term, I think what is required is avoiding the use of highly enriched uranium, minimizing the proliferation of enrichment facilities by offering enriched fuel on attractive terms and establishing fuel banks so countries are assured that they can get at it, minimizing the inventories of separated plutonium by minimizing reprocessing and maximizing plutonium disposition, getting rid of the stuff, and by improving the protection and safeguards for all of the stocks of both highly enriched uranium and plutonium that remain. In the longer run, I think we have a number of choices that we may well need to embrace. One would be avoiding plutonium recycle indefinitely, or avoiding plutonium recycle in forms where the plutonium is completely separated from fission products and other actinides. That's the second thing, develop recycle technologies that don't completely separate it. And a third possibility would be placing, in the long run, all enrichment and reprocessing facilities under international management and protection. Now, I'm running very short on time. I want to very quickly simply point out that the studies that MIT has conducted on the future of nuclear energy, the 2003 study, the 2009 update of that, and the 2010 study whose summary volume is now out on the nuclear fuel cycle, has, in my judgment, reached all the right conclusions. And believe me, I'm circulating these widely in Washington. We should be accelerating the next generation of nuclear orders with basically approaches that reduce the risk premium. The once-through fuel cycle is what we ought to be using for the foreseeable future. We need better planning for long-term managed storage of spent nuclear fuel. We should be moving already to centralized spent nuclear fuel storage sites. We should be pursuing fuel leasing options for countries with small nuclear programs. We need to do more research on innovative reactor and fuel cycle options for the future. In the long run, it is surely possible to do better than the current variants. We should be doing R&D to improve the repository options for long-term storage of waste. And again, we should be pursuing these leasing programs. Turn finally very quickly to fusion. And the question I sometimes get asked, is it worth the trouble? Or another way of asking that question is it worth the money? What are the reasons for having fusion? Well, the fuel supply is much larger than for fission, as we saw, but that's really not much of an advantage because the fuel supply for fission is already so huge. Ask a policymaker what the difference is between 10 million years worth of fuel and 10 billion years. And policymakers' timescales are generally 2, 4, and 6 years. Difference between 10 million and 10 billion is not a huge asset.